Welcome to an episode of the award-winning podcast Art Insiders New York. My name is Anders Holst. The theme of the podcast is New York, with a focus on behind-the-scenes conversations with fascinating people who are making an impact in the world of art, design, and architecture. Joshua Jelly-Shapiro is an award-winning American geographer and writer. In his latest book, Names of New York, he traces the ways in which native Lenape, Dutch settlers, British invaders, and successive waves of immigrants have left their marks on the city's map. In this interview, we talk about how several places in New York got their names: Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bowery, Greenwich Village, Spuyten Duyvil, Lackawanna, Boerum Hill, to mention a few. We talk about how place matters to us as human beings and how it shapes our beliefs about who we are. We also discuss more complex issues relating to place naming. For example, 70 streets in Brooklyn are named after slave owners. Should these names be erased from the cityscape, or should they remain as a historic marker? Joshua is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. He lives in New York and is a scholar in residence at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, where he also teaches. Very welcome to the podcast Art Insiders New York.
Thanks for having me. Pleased to be here.
And congratulations to this wonderful book that you've written about names of New York. Streets, parks, boroughs, bridges, playgrounds, islands also. There is a chapter for that. And it's wonderful. I love this quote that is on the book here. It says, "A casually wondrous experience. It made me feel like the city was unfolding beneath my feet." I just love it. So I was wondering, before we get into the book, though, what does a geographer do? You are presented as a writer and a geographer. What do you do? Do you study maps?
It's a very good question. Yes, studying maps is one thing that I do. Certainly, I'm a great lover of maps, a cartophile, if you like. But no, I get asked that question a lot, and sometimes my students ask me, and of course they wonder if I just study all the state capitals or capitals of the world, just geographic trivia. And the answer is really no to that question, though that's not a bad thing to study. No, doing a PhD in geography really, to my mind, or at least in my case, meant thinking about all the ways in which place matters to human beings and the ways in which a sense of place shapes our beliefs about who we are, who we want to be, where we want to go. I believe that place is fundamental to so many sort of realms of life and culture. And so really my life and career has been in a lot of ways just devoted to that idea and to writing about place and narrating place and thinking about how and why place shapes us as people.
Yeah. So that means it must integrate a lot of different areas like history and how we interact socially and culture and cultural history. You have written books before, The Island People, the Caribbean and the World in 2016, and I saw a very interesting review here by Marlon James, who said that many have tried to get hold of it in its entirety, the volatile, beautiful, relentless, shifting Caribbean. Nobody has succeeded as dazzlingly. I think that's a very good review of your work.
Well, Marlon was very kind to give me that. Yeah.
And you've also been involved in Nonstop Metropolis, a New York City atlas, and you wrote the foreword to Chris O'Feely's Paradise Lost. Am I correct?
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that was a fun project, a little collaboration with Chris, who's an artist I really admire, and those were photos and works of his from Trinidad in the Caribbean, where he lives. So had the fun of writing a weird essay about the cultural history of chain link fences. So. That was fun, but no, Chris is a great artist, and that was a fun project.
And then you wrote Cuba Then, Cuba Now, which was an excerpt from your previous work that you put in a book form.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it was the chapters on Cuba from Island People, and then updated with a couple of new essays just about Cuba since the death of Fidel Castro. So,
how do these different books relate to one another? Is there a theme here, or how do you explain it?
Yeah, no, I to me, there is a theme that joins them. And one of those, the central theme just being place, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
profoundly interested in sort of how humans shape place and how place shapes people. And so my work on the Caribbean has been, was sort of born of a really lifelong affinity for the culture and music and literature of the Antilles. And I spent many years essentially living in the islands off and on and writing about history and culture as a journalist in that part of the world and across the Americas. And so that book just grew out of that fascination with these larger questions, but also with the particular music and literature and culture of Cuba and Jamaica and Trinidad and Puerto Rico and all these places I care about, Haiti as well. And my more recent work on cities, on New York City most notably, in this book, Names of New York, and also this atlas, Nonstop Metropolis, that I created with a bunch of people, maps of the city of an experimental kind, really has to do with a fascination with cities and the ways in which cities contain an infinite number of ways to be mapped, if you like. They contain an infinity of stories of overlapping histories that all of us who live in a place like New York bring to it, and also all the histories that have shaped this place. So, as you say, geography, brings together a lot of different disciplines in a sense, history and anthropology and humanities, and I certainly think the great fun challenge as a writer and a writer who cares about geography is to try and bring these things together in a vivid and lively way. So hopefully I've done so in this book.
So the book, Names of New York. Can you tell us a little bit about how did this come about? What was the idea? Did you wake up one day and said, now I'm going to write a book about...
Well, yeah, it's. I wish I could remember the moment specifically, but I think it really did grow out of my work on Nonstop Metropolis, which is a volume of these quirky maps, very many different ways to map the city. But of course, to create any map, you're kind of immersed in the names that make it up, all the place names that are familiar and also perhaps not familiar. We have all the iconic ones in New York that everyone knows, Broadway and Times Square and Manhattan and Harlem and so on. But of course, there are thousands of others that are maybe only famous to the people who live in the neighborhoods, who live on those blocks that they describe. But which is to say that I was sort of immersed in names and creating maps and essays about the city. But I had always been fascinated by place names, about where they come from, about how they shape our sense of a place and our sense of what's possible as well. And I think this book was in certain ways inspired by... There's a great old book called Names on the Land, which is a book by a writer called George R. Stewart. It came out in the 1940s about American place names and essentially just riffing on all the stories behind them. And I love that book. And I thought, it'd be so neat to do a book like that in New York, but that then also perhaps adds a contemporary political angle in terms of thinking about, the politics of names and not only where they come from, but whether and how we think about changing them or what histories we honor in place names. So it was a great way to kind of get at a bunch of those questions, but also just geek out, if you like, on place names and digging into the stories behind them.
Yeah, that's what I like about your book, because you insert some fun reflections and some sharp comments on things.
Yeah, gotta do it. Gotta keep it engaged. Yeah, facts only go so far. So.
I like what you say about the people in Williamsburg. I enjoyed that very much. I lived in Soho, so I got my fair share of your
equal opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. So when you were doing this, was there anything that you found especially intriguing?
Yeah, well, I mean, many things, of course, contemporary stories about all the sort of streets that stick in people's minds, honorary streets, whether they honor, ice cream vendors or beloved, Little League coaches or, national heroes from the Dominican Republic or China or any number of the countries that people in New York hail from. So many stories like that. But, one thing that really I was fascinated by and surprised by were the ways in which so many place names, whether they're Dutch or English or whatever else, the ones that stick or the ones that we tend to recall, often I think it just has to do with how they hit our ears, the way that they sound. And I think, for example, of, I mentioned Harlem earlier. Harlem today is this iconic, neighborhood of Black history and African-American pride. It's a sort of mecca for Black culture. And Harlem signifies those things to us. Of course, Harlem was, coined by some Dutchmen back in the 1600s who named that part of Manhattan after the town they were from back in Holland. And they, of course, were not thinking or could not have known about what Harlem would mean later on. Yeah. But I love the ways in which that simple word, today it signifies something else. Those two syllables, they sound good. They've lent themselves to poetry and music, and I'm very thankful that the English didn't succeed in changing the name of Harlem. They wanted to change it to Lancaster. And I have to say, Lancaster just doesn't resonate in the same way. The Lancaster Renaissance just wouldn't be as good.
No, it doesn't. I mean, there are a couple of big takeaways from this book, and one is, of course, what you just mentioned here, that you talk about the Dutch settlers. First of all, the Lenape, the native people who lived here, right? And then you have the Dutch settlers, the British invaders. I like that. And then, of course, contemporary Americans. And when you look at New York and the names through that lens, it's very obvious, of course, but you don't think about it. But then it becomes very obvious, and it sorts out things. I mean, I like that. I take the train along the Hudson, and you pass Spuyten Duyvil. Is that how you pronounce it? Spuyten Duyvil?
I love hearing you pronounce it.
It's sort of Dutch.
That's closer to how it's said. Yeah, exactly.
Spuyten Duyvil. How do
New Yorkers, I tend to hear it Spuyten Duyvil is how New Yorkers tend to say it. So it's like,
So I was thinking, what the hell does that mean? So I was looking at your book, and so what does it mean?
Yeah, into the old Dutch, it meant the Devil's Whirlpool, right? Which is wonderful. It's where the Harlem River, hits the Hudson, and so it's this old kind of lyrical description of the whirlpools that may have existed there once, the Devil's Whirlpool. But I love, there's so many of these old Dutch names, and similarly, obviously, we talk about the Native American ones too, and the English. Yeah. But many of the Dutch names, that were kept by the English, or at least survived, and have survived to now. Of course, most people have no idea what they mean or refer to. That's a great example, Spuyten Duyvil. But others as well, something like Coney Island, in Dutch, it meant Coney Islands. It meant island of rabbits. It meant something. And in English, it doesn't mean anything, but I think we like the sound. So they kept it. Another one, Gramercy Park, for example. Gramercy, it sounds like maybe an English word. It kind of puts you in mind of London, maybe because it's a park that looks like London. Yeah. But in fact, that was just an English riff on the Dutch name for that part of Manhattan, the Crow Marsh or some such. My pronunciation's not great, but in the old Dutch, it was the Crooked Marsh, right?
Oh, so, I see.
Yeah, and so the English took those words and made them sound English, but they have a root in Dutch, and they mean something.
You also mentioned the Greenwich, Green District, Greenwich Village, along those lines, right? And the Bowery, the Bowery, the Farm Road. It's just fascinating. I find
absolutely, yeah, no, and these, of course, there are all these remnants, but yeah, the Bowery, which we know as the Bowery, comes from, of course, as you say, the old Dutch word for farm road, and it's still with us. And there are many names like this.
One part of your book that I really like when it comes to giving an insight into how to research the true meaning of places is the conversation you have about Manhattan, where you look at the origin of that word from many different sources. You had like 3 references there. The John Gottlieb Ernestus Heckenweider, who says the island where all become intoxicated. And then the William Wallace Stoker, Island of the Hills, and Albert Anthony, Place for Bow and Timber. This is all about Manhattan, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Those are essentially these different versions throughout time of explanations as to what the old Lenape word Mannahatta, from which Manhattan is derived, what that meant. Because, of course, like many native place words that we have with us, essentially it's just an approximation of what some European person heard perhaps a native person say. In that case, one of Henry Hudson's sailors, literally in 1609, they met some indigenous people, some Lenape men, it sounds like, along Manhattan's west side. And evidently one of them perhaps gestured or said something that sounded like Mannahatta, and this sailor wrote it in his log. And that is from whence we get the word Manhattan. But it's quite unclear as to what that person was trying to convey. It's quite unclear whether they were even pointing to Manhattan or pointing across the river to New Jersey or what. So there's been great confusion about that. And those people you cited were, different versions of what it might have meant, Island of Hills or what have you. But it seems like our best guess now is that the syllables Mannahattan in the Lenape language do mean place where we gathered wood for bows and arrows. So the linguists and people of the community who still speak that language, their best guess at this point is perhaps place where we gathered wood for bows and arrows, which fits because there were lots of trees in Manhattan once upon a time.
Are there any names that are still a mystery to people, where the academics sort of still disagree on what is what? I mean, are there any black spots on your map here?
Yeah, no, excellent question. And I think the answer is yes, there are many, and most of them, in fact, are these indigenous place words, right? Because we have many of them on the map. We don't necessarily think of all of them or recognize them as derived from the Lenape language. The Lenape were, as you say, the people who were here when Europeans arrived. They spoke an Algonquian language, so related to many of the languages in this part of the continent. And they have descendants who still speak it. Most of them are in Ontario or in Oklahoma. Not many people left, but they are still with us, thankfully. And there is a lot of disagreement about these words. But think of it, we have just over across the river in New Jersey. You have Hackensack, and you have Hoboken and Passaic and Raritan. In Brooklyn, you have Canarsie. Gowanus, you have Rockaway out in Queens.
Okay. Take them one at a time here then. Okay, so because I was going to say Lackawanna, because you see that when you drive along the West Side Highway. I always think, what the heck does that mean? So on New Jersey side, Hoboken then. There's Frank Sinatra's birthplace.
Well, see, you're putting me on the spot here, but I would say Hoboken, Passaic, if I'm remembering correctly, there was most of those place words essentially reference sort of water, and this makes sense. It's quite marshy there, so they mean things like place where river empties into the bay, or marshy spot with two rivers. There's I think Rockaway derives from I believe the Lenape word, or our best guess is place of grasses. So many of these things. There are sort of good guesses as to what they mean, but many of them are, linguists disagree, in fact, because they are sort of English or Dutch transcriptions of what may have been sort of spoken or enunciated by Lenape people once upon a time. So there is some disagreement as to what they all mean. But Anders, I'll give you a good example too. Jamaica out in Queens.
Yes.
Always mysterious. And you always, you take the train out to the airport and you're going to Jamaica, and people may wonder. And for a long time, people said, it derived from a local indigenous word for a lake in that part of Queens called Jamaica, or a pond that someone wrote down. And that was for a long time. That was the theory, that it was some derivation of a local word. I think our best guess now, though, is that essentially the English named it after what else? The island in the Caribbean where they were making a lot of money off of sugar slavery at that point. And so named it Jamaica after that. That Jamaica, of course, is also an indigenous word from the Caribbean. It means land of woods and water, from the Arawak language of the Antilles. So anyway, many of these stories are quite, convoluted and strange, but it's so fascinating how and why certain names stick.
That is so cool. You work really hard, and then you figure out, it's named from Jamaica. We could rest here. Lackawanna, Forked River. I think you mentioned in your book, Forked River. Does that make any sense? Or yeah.
Sounds right. Of course, Lackawanna. The sign that you see from the west side. It's on the train and ferry terminal there. It's for the Lackawanna Railroad that once ran to a place called Lackawanna out by Buffalo in western New York. So. That's what that reference is. But yes, there you go, Forked River.
And Brooklyn, let's take that too, because there are many listeners here saying, okay, well, come to Brooklyn then. Explain to us, what the heck is that?
Yeah, well, Brooklyn, of course, the name derives from one of the original Dutch villages. There were 6 of them there in what's now Brooklyn. The village that they called Brooklyn was there by essentially what's Dumbo now, or a little further down, right by the Brooklyn Bridge, and it was a village there on the river. There are many. Honestly, there are a couple of different versions as to where the Dutch got that. The simplest version is there is a place in Holland of that name, so it's essentially a kind of naming after situation. But there is an etymology, because the spelling changed quite a bit across time, that essentially Brooklyn means some version of broken land, which is to say, because it's so marshy, there are many parts of Brooklyn that are sort of soft and broken land. And that's a case where that may or may not, in fact, be the case. It sounds logical. It sounds good. Whether that was the original derivation of the Dutch village of Brooklyn, we're not sure, because it was anglicized. The spelling was changed across time. Yeah. But in any case, Brooklyn is named for that original little village there by the river.
Another takeaway from your book that really organized my thoughts was when you talk about that in the beginning, and I think you can explain this much better than I. In the beginning, a place was named after its setting or its sponsor.
Thank you. Yeah, no, now I know what you're referencing. Yeah, in essentially we're thinking now about Lower Manhattan and about what was once the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam, which had, like many towns and villages, you could think of this, that when it's built up, you have Water Street, it's on the water. You have Bridge Street that goes over, a canal. You have Church Street, you have Park Street. These are very kind of just descriptive, simple phrases for what a street's function in a place. And I think that later on, as something expands and you have way more, than one street for everything, for every occupation, you often get, the owners, the people who have now built an estate outside town, whether that's the Bleekers or the Delanceys or Stuyvesant, the Governor General of New Netherland. So that as you got further out from the old village of New Amsterdam, and many of these place names are still with us, you have basically landowners who have laid claim to a place, and many of those names, Bleecker, Delancey, these ones were big farms that were owned by illustrious families in the 1700s in New York, and we still have those place names, even though now they're urbanized. Yeah. But then later on, I think this is the thing, right? It's that the outskirts that are named for sort of wealthy or illustrious people, and then later on they can be named for anything, for particular heroes or people who want to be honored. You live in Soho, Anders, and of course many of the streets in Soho, for example, are we don't think of this, but are named essentially for, famous soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. So you have, Wooster and Mercer and Greene and Thompson and Sullivan, and all of these, we don't think of them. I don't think most people don't as referencing people, but of course they do. And these were not landowners or anything. They were just people who were heroes in their day. And essentially when those streets were laid out, that's what people were thinking about and wanting to commemorate, is freedom from Great Britain. And so you had, you have a lot of streets in Manhattan that are named for these soldiers.
Yes, and I like when you talk about the sort of when places or neighborhoods are named after then subdivisions. You talked about, for instance, Corona in Queens, which is just Crown, I guess that's what they want.
Yeah,
and this guy with Astor. That when they named Astoria after Astor, right? Because they wanted him to support the neighborhood, and he basically never got there. Or what happened? He never gave any money to them.
That's a funny story where you have Astoria, wonderful neighborhood in Queens, right over the East River from Manhattan, and it was named John Jacob Astor, who was the kind of magnate of fur, first of all, but then, his family came to own huge parts of New York, and massively wealthy. That's the same Astor, of course, of Astor Place and many other locations in the city. But old man Astor, he was very wealthy, and he had a house on the Upper East Side. And these people the man who chartered what became Astoria, is just a village in Queens at that point. He was hopeful in the 1840s that Astor would give them money to fund their town. So essentially they named it Astoria in his honor, and he never went. He sent them $500, which, in the 1840s was a significant sum, but not enough to bankroll them for forever. And that was it. So he threw them something, but he never went to visit, which is funny. But no, what you say about, so many neighborhoods, of course, are, especially out in Queens or in southern Brooklyn, or places that, were developed rapidly in the late 1800s and the first half of the 20th century, basically turning farmland into neighborhoods. And so basically developers coined these names, whether those are, Jackson Heights or Utopia Parkway was named for a development called Utopia that never came to be.
I love that story because I drive through that and I take a picture of that sign and put it on Instagram. I love that. Utopia. And then you told me in the book here, it doesn't lead anywhere.
It doesn't lead. No, they were hoping to build this development called Utopia that was going to allow Jews and other people who had a hard time finding housing in the early 20th century, but the developers sadly ran out of money. So they kept Utopia Parkway, but the housing development never came to pass.
Yeah, and Ozone Park. I've been thinking about that too, if it's anything about the ozone layer, but it has nothing to do with that. It's apparently about the fresh air.
You're quite correct. Yeah, the ozone layer, we speaking about it a little less now, but it obviously has entered the parlance in recent years, thinking about climate change and so on. But no, Ozone Park was named by its developer. This was in the late 1800s. And essentially it was meant to sort of tout the proximity to the sea breezes off the Atlantic. They said that you're near the ozone, which I guess was the in the parlance in that era, meant something quite different, but basically trying to entice people to head out there. Another one right out there, owners, that's kind of funny is Arvern, or Arvern by the Sea, which is there by the Rockaways, actually, southern Queens, by the ocean. And this is a funny one where the developer there was a fellow called R. Vernum. His first initial was R, and he signed his checks R. Vernum. And as the story goes, his wife liked that phrase and how it sounded and said, well, this new development you're building, you should just call it Arvern, Arverne. And there it is. You can visit Arvern to this day. So random word, but it stuck.
It's incredible. I was thinking, what was Soho called before it was named Soho? Because that came in 1962, if I'm correct here.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder if it had a nickname. I mean, essentially a sort of undifferentiated part of Lower Manhattan, or the greater village. It was a kind of no man land between, the old Dutch city and the village a little higher up. So it's a good question what it was called back then.
Maybe something with cast iron, but I don't think that was it. Maybe not. And then from your book, I mean, there's so many stories here, and it becomes almost like we're going through the. People have to read your book, of course, but a few more of these places that we talk about. So Boerum Hill, and Cobble Hill, you think that sounds really cool and old and fancy, but it's not that old, actually.
No, Boerum Hill. I mean, the name, comes from an old Dutch family that owned land in that part of Brooklyn long ago. But basically, Boerum Hill comes from, I think, 1960s, or even more recently, when the neighborhood association there trying to get essentially historic landmark status and to sort of celebrate, the beautiful brownstone architecture of that part of Brooklyn, kind of coined it as Boerum Hill. The irony there is that it's slightly higher than some of the surrounding areas, but you could hardly sort of call it a hill, I think. And it's funny, there are many areas of the city that have these like heights, Jackson Heights being another one, where their sort of namers give them these names to give them a kind of prestige that is often not about their height or altitude at all. So we have it. But neighborhood names, many, especially in recent decades, they have sort of proliferated, and partly it's about, the people who have a vested interest in selling neighborhoods essentially as commodities. It's about real estate. And so you have all these new nicknames that crop up.
Yeah, exactly. Another one of my favorite here is the Buttermilk Channel that people thought was named after farmers who went from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and in the channel, the milk got to be butter, whatever. I thought that was...
Oh, that's right. So Buttermilk Channel, there's a couple versions. One being Buttermilk Channel is the bit of water between Red Hook, Brooklyn, and Governor's Island, so off of Lower Manhattan there. Mm-hmm. And one story goes that... essentially that channel often it got at low tide, you could actually walk across it. And so cows would go to Governor's Island to graze. And so perhaps they said, Buttermilk Channel for that. But the more kind of poetic version, which I rather love, is this idea that farmers who were bringing their butter to Manhattan, that the water was so choppy that it would churn the milk into butter, which sounds like it would have to be extremely choppy. I'm not sure I buy the story, but it's a great etymology. It's rather excellent. So, so many stories like that.
So toponymy is the overarching. So what is toponymy?
Yeah, I mean, essentially just the fancy word for the study of place name.
I see.
Topos being, the Greek term for place. So toponymy, the study of place names. And it's a very, niche field. This is not something you can get a degree in or anything. But there are people, as I say, who are obsessed with place names and love studying them, where they come from and what they do. And so it's been fun to at least dip my toe into that field to write this book.
Yeah, you also bring up some issues now that are very, in the news, and that is, of course, things that have been named. You bring up Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who is commemorated on a street in Brooklyn, and he's known for massacring his ex-colony masters. So where do you stand in this debate of, should we revise history? Should we change things? Should we take away? You mentioned also in your book that there's 70 streets in Brooklyn named after slave owners. So I think that's a very interesting question. And so what is your view on that?
Yeah, we are living through a really vital reckoning with history. And I think that was part of the impetus for writing this book, that we're thinking about, statues and what we commemorate in public space and what place names and street names, what histories are visible and which ones are made invisible. And so for me, absolutely, there's often good cause to be changing names or taking down certain statues that were erected at a certain point in time for a certain set of values that we may reject. And I'm sort of alluding to, many of the Confederate monuments down south, for example, which were put up, not during the Civil War as neutral markers of history, but some decades later to assert white supremacy. So I have no issue at all with taking those down and changing those names. In fact, I believe deeply that they should. be removed. There are also, though, many cases, and I think that these street names in Brooklyn that you just mentioned, that name or named after people who some centuries ago were in Brooklyn and owned slaves. I am not of the view that all those necessarily need to be changed. And I think that the reason why is that those are, in fact, remnants or markers of history that we need to recall and confront and remember. And also they are names that have taken on many different meanings across time. People who live on, say, Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn, that's a street that's deeply identified now with Caribbean culture, for example. And I don't think that changing the name necessarily does any favors to either to the people who've come to identify with that name or to making its history visible. So these are, all that is to say, these are complex questions. There's not one answer that we need to change all names or leave all names the same. I think it has to be a case-by-case basis. But I'm, of course, deeply impressed by and care a lot about, efforts to confront our history in public space. And part of that, I think, is just erecting new monuments and new memorials to histories that haven't been celebrated or properly recalled.
What is your relationship to New York? You're not a New Yorker to begin with.
That's right. Yeah, no, I mean, I have, I like to say, like many Americans, I have a family history that kind of runs through New York and through Ellis Island specifically. My father's family, Jersey City and Brooklyn, Bayonne, New Jersey. And essentially, so that is to say, they came to Ellis Island and got about 2 miles away from it. So right across the water. But yeah, I grew up mostly in bucolic Vermont. So not in New York City, but I've lived here for, a large chunk of my adult life and I've always spent time in New York, and I it's become home. And I think one of the things about this city that I love about it, as compared to other cities where I've spent time and where I also care about, I think New York is a place that kind of makes space for you if you are willing to kind of claim it. I think that it's obviously a deeply challenging place to live. All of us who live here know has its frustrations, and having to hustle is not easy always here. But I think that, if you show up off a plane or from the provinces and get into the rhythm of it and start, complaining about the C train running late, you're kind of a New Yorker. Whereas I think that, many cities in the old world or in New Orleans, say, another place I care about, if you don't go back 7 generations, you kind of don't count as of that place. But I think that New York is this marvelous, meeting of people from everywhere who've come to try and make it here. And it doesn't always work out, but I think that everyone, if you want to come and have a go, you can do so. New York makes space for that.
Yeah. So what are your favorite parts of New York where you like to hang out, or does it vary over time? I love to explore the entire city, very honestly, but I a couple places I love are, I love being by the water and just thinking about, when it was full of ships and sort of routes to elsewhere. So I love Red Hook, Brooklyn, where I wrote a lot of this book. I also love, I mentioned Jackson Heights in Queens, and that part of North Central Queens, which, is really now where kind of immigrant New York is most alive. And not only that, but it's the part of the city and indeed of the world where more languages are spoken within a few square miles than anywhere else on the planet, in history, in fact, as my linguist friends like to say. So I love being out there, the vitality and mixture of people from the four corners of the earth, out in a neighborhood like Jackson Heights, where I lived for briefly a few years ago. But I go back. Certainly I go back for food and to see friends. And anyway, that's a great corner of the city too. What is your next step here? Any books in the pipeline?
Anders, you can't ask me that. No, there's stuff I should be finishing and I'm not finished with. But I'm for now I'm loving talking about this project and sort of thinking about all the other questions that it raises for the city. It's been a really fun project to write and then to engage with people on.
How has it been received? How is the?
Yeah, well, I mean, wonderfully by and large. It's been great. I've been gratified by the reception, just because I think that people are inherently interested, whether they know it or not, in these sort of questions of where names come from, the places that shape their days. Oh, wow, it's interesting to pause and think about it. And also, of course, I love, when I go on the radio and talk about it or do talks, people love to get up and ask questions. Where does so-and-so name come from? And, sometimes I get lucky because I've, studied this stuff, so I know a good bit, but obviously I don't know every street in New York. So sometimes I have to say, well, you have to look it up. But I'm glad I piqued your interest in wanting to do so.
One of the names that have intrigued me, of course, and that has a sad connotation to the 9/11, is, of course, Fresh Kills, landfilled in Staten Island. And that has a specific history, as far as I understand.
Yeah, no, Fresh Kills. I mean, the word kills, it's interesting, right? It's just the Dutch word for creek or waterway. So there are many kills around the city, the Arthur Kill and the Colvan Kill and Peekskill upstate. And so that's, of course, the origins of kill. Fresh Kills, it's interesting. I think essentially when the English took over from the Dutch, they seem to have retained many of these kills, or at least the phrase kill, and so named that part of Staten Island Fresh Kills, presumably because it had fresh water to differentiate it from, or for some other reason. But essentially, of course, Fresh Kills became the city dump. It became this immense landfill later on, and there's all these stories. You could see it from space and so on. I'm not sure that was the case, but it was in a huge garbage dump, and was closed down right around the time of 9/11. It was ceased being used right before then, and the remnants, basically all the rubble and remains from 9/11 ended up in Fresh Kills. Much of it did. And now, though, that part of Staten Island has been turned into a quite wonderful park. It's been revived and resuscitated. So it's a nice story of the ways in which that landscape has changed. But the sort of the final resting place, if you like, of the remains of, that awful day in New York's history, did go to Fresh Kills, which is where the remains of many things in city history landed for a long time.
Yeah. I've noticed that you have a very broad scope here. You write articles on Cuba, Bob Marley, phonography, soccer, and other issues. And I learned that you are an Arsenal fan.
This is true. Guilty as charged. I'm a great lover of football, and Arsenal is not as good nowadays as they were some years ago. But
what is your verdict here on Arteta? And
I like Arteta. I like Mikel. I think he's he understands the culture of the club. I think the players like him and like playing for him. So I'm hopeful. Put it that way. It was a rough start to the season, but I'm hopeful.
Well, Joshua, thank you so much. The book is Names of New York, and it's a wonderful book, and I learned so much about the city that we love so much. So I'm very grateful for that, and I'm grateful for you taking the time to elaborate on the wonderful stories in the book. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
This is Art Insiders New York, and my name is Anders Holst. If you enjoyed this episode and have family and friends who love New York and are passionate about the world of art, design, and architecture, please spread the word by following us on artinsidersnewyork.com or liking us on our Facebook page, Art Insiders New York, where we publish newsworthy material all the time. It's very much appreciated. Thank you. This episode was produced by UOM LLC, copyright 2022.